The snow was falling the day they sold me. Soft flakes landing on the dust, melting on faces that had come to watch my father's lesson. Folks love a show when it ain't about them. The street outside the general store smelled of smoke and horse sweat. The air thick with the kind of silence that comes before shame that I remember standing there barefoot. My dress torn where Pa had yanked me out the house. I was 16, too round, too stubborn, too loud for his liking. He said a daughter like me was a burden no man take for free. So he didn't sell me for money. He sold me for pride. The man who took me stood a few yards away, tall and quiet as the mountains behind him. Elias Boone, they whispered. The hermit up in Bitterroot Pass. Lived alone with his rifle and his ghosts. He didn't flinch when Pa spat my name like a curse. Just looked at me once, like a man studying whether he'd rather not walk through, and gave the smallest NODPA shoved me forward. Take her, he said. She'll learn obedience where mouths freeze before they speak. The crowd chuckled, some with pity, most with pleasure. I wanted to scream, but my throat had already burned out all the words on the ride into town. When Elias spoke, his voice was low, gravel dragged through whiskey. Get your coat, he said. I ain't got one, I muttered. He frowned, turned to Pa. She'll freeze before we reach the ridge. Pa shrugged. She'll learn. That's how I left home, bare-armed in the falling snow, sitting beside a stranger on a wagon that creaked like an old man's bones. The road wound upward into the mountains, the world fading behind us. The pines closed in like sentinels. Wind howled through the gullies, tossing my hair into my eyes. I kept my arms tight around me, watching my breath bloom and vanish. He didn't speak for miles. Only the clatter of hooves, the groan of the wheels, the faint smell of pine tar and leathered at dusk. He passed me a strip of jerky. Eat, he said. I shook my head. Ain't hungry. He didn't press. Just ate his own and kept driving. Night fell quick in the high country. The moon hung thin, like a blade in the dark. When the wagon stopped, I thought it was the end of the road, but it was his cabin. A single lantern glowed behind the frosted window, light swaying gentle with the wind. Inside, it was small but clean. There was one chair, a stove, and a narrow bed covered with a wool blanket. He hung his coat, poured water into a tin cup, then pointed to the rug near the fire. You can sleep there. I waited for more, for anger, for orders, but none came. He just moved around quiet, like a man afraid to disturb the ghosts living with him. When he finally sat, I watched the flames flicker across his face, scarred at the jawline, beard rough, eyes steady but distant. Outside, the storm gathered. The wind moaned through the gaps in the logs. I wrapped myself in the blanket, my body aching from cold and shame. That first night, I didn't sleep. I watched him instead. How he turned the pages of a small book by the firelight, how his lips moved without sound. At one point, he looked over and caught me staring. I froze, but he didn't scold, didn't say a thing. He just nodded toward the hearth. Fire'll go out if you don't feed it. So I got up, fed the flames, and sat back down. That was the first order I obeyed, not out of fear, but because it felt like something close to kindness. Days slid by without words. He'd leave before dawn with traps slung over his shoulder, come back at dusk with game, set it to dry. I cleaned, cooked, fetched water. He never said thank you, but he didn't treat me like property either. We were two lonely souls orbiting the same silence. Once, when he caught me crying, I turned away fast. But I heard him move behind me, then set something beside my hand, a steaming tin of coffee. Best drink it while it's hot, he said, and walked out into the snow that I drank it. Every bitter, beautiful sip, winter deepened. The creek froze, the sky turned hard as glass. I grew used to the stillness, the rhythm of the fire, the creak of the roof under snow's weight. I didn't know if he pitied me or forgot I existed, but something in his quiet steadiness began to thaw the fear in me. Sometimes, he'd carve small figures from pine. I'd watch from the corner as shavings fell like feathers to the floor. When he finished, he left one by the window. A bird, wings stretched wide. I never saw him give it to me, but it was there, waiting. I placed it by my blanket like a secret I wasn't supposed to have. One night, the wind started howling louder than before. I woke to the sound of the door banging open. The fire was nearly out, and Elias was gone. The chair lay toppled. I pulled on my boots, heart pounding. Outside, the world was white and wild. Then I saw it, a dark shape near the stream, moving slow against the storm's fury. Lightning cracked, and for an instant, the mountain lit up, Elias wrestling with a massive grizzly, the beast's roar swallowed by the thunder that I don't remember thinking. I just grabbed the lantern and ran. My feet sank into snow up to my knees, breath slicing my throat. The wind ripped the light sideways, but I kept going, toward the sound of struggle, toward the man who'd never once raised his voice at me. When I reached him, I screamed his name. The bear swung its head, eyes blazing. I hurled the lantern. It shattered, flames scattering across the snow, a burst of gold and terror. The animal reared, then turned, vanishing into the darkness with a final growl that shook my ribs. Elias staggered, fell to one knee, blood soaking his sleeve. I dropped beside him, snow melting beneath our heat, the storm closing in around us. He looked at me through the blur of falling flakes and said, half smiling, "You fool." I gripped his arm, breathless. "You're the one bleeding." The storm swallowed the rest. All I could hear was the wind, the beating of my heart, and his voice whispering something I couldn't catch as we struggled back toward the faint glow of the cabin's dying fire.
By dawn, the storm had broken. The sky above the ridge glowed pale, soft as breath against glass. Inside the cabin, I sat by the fire with Elias's head resting on my lap. His wound was deep, but not fatal. I'd torn a strip from my dress to bind his arm, hands trembling as I worked. The smell of blood and smoke hung heavy, but so did something else, trust, raw and fragile as the morning light. When he finally stirred, his eyes flickered open, cloudy with exhaustion. "You should have stayed inside," he muttered. "You should have too," I whispered back. He gave the faintest grin before drifting off again. For the first time, I felt the stillness of the mountain not as punishment, but as mercy. No eyes to judge, no tongues to wound, just wind, pine, and the quiet rhythm of two hearts refusing to quit. In the days that followed, I took care of him. Cooked what meat we had left, changed the bandage when the bleeding slowed. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was always soft. Words worn smooth from years of silence. One evening, as the fire burned low, he spoke without looking up. "Folks say I came up here to find peace," he said. "Truth is, I came to bury it. Too many ghosts down there. I didn't ask which ghosts." He glanced at me. "Your pa's the kind who thinks pain's a cure. Ain't a cure I ever seen." I stared into the fire. "He thought shame had burned the pride out of me." Elias nodded slowly. "And did it?" I shook my head. "Just burned everything else." He chuckled low, a sound like dry leaves shifting in the wind. That night, he let me take the bed while he slept by the fire. I waited until his breathing slowed, then whispered, "Thank you." He didn't answer, but I saw his shoulders ease, like the words reached him anyway. The snow melted slow that year. Spring came with color so sudden it hurt the eyes. The creek sang again, wildflowers burst through old snowbanks, and I felt something bloom in me too. I learned to set traps, to mend nets, to listen for the mountain's moods. My body grew stronger, my steps steadier. The girl who had arrived, broken and ashamed, began to vanish with the winter. Sometimes he'd watch me from the porch, whittling his wood figures. Never said much, but there was pride in his silence. Once I caught him staring at me a beat too long. I turned away, cheeks hot. There were no words for what lived between us, only the warmth of small things. His calloused hand steadying me as I crossed the icy creek. My laughter when he tried and failed to bake biscuits. Those moments stitched the quiet together, thread by thread. Then came the day the riders arrived. Sheriff Tom Burrell and Mary Jo Ellis. Their horses kicked up dust as they reached the cabin. I was tending the fire, hands black with soot, when I heard her voice, sharp and sweet as poison. "Well, I'll be. If it ain't little Clara Dillard. My, how the mountains filled her out even more." Laughter followed, mean and small. I froze, shame rising like a fever. Elias stepped out onto the porch, calm, his rifle resting easy in his hands. "What brings you this far, Sheriff?" Burrell cleared his throat. "Just checking all's proper up here. Folks in town got talking. Girl's been gone near half a year. Her father's worried," Mary Jo snorted. "Worried she might have gone wild." Elias didn't rise to it. He just said, "She's free to leave whenever she wants." I looked at him surprised. And for the first time since the day we met, I realized He'd never once treated me as something owned. They left with their gossip. But that night, as I washed dishes by the creek, I caught my reflection in the water and saw a woman looking back. Not a fat, shamed girl anymore. A woman who could swing an axe, start a fire, skin a rabbit, and speak her mind without trembling. The mountain hadn't changed me. It had reminded me what strength looked like. Weeks later, the thaw gave way to spring storms. One evening, thunder rolled across the peaks, and I saw two riders again. Only this time, it was my father and the sheriff. They dismounted, boots sinking in the mud. Pa's face was harder, older. "Clara," he said, voice graveled with pride and something meaner. "Pack your things. You're coming home." "I ain't got no home down there," I said quietly. He frowned. "You belong to your kin." "No," Elias said, stepping forward, calm but firm. "She belongs to herself." Pa turned on him, fury sparking. "You took my daughter to bed and call it mercy? You ruined her name." Elias didn't flinch. "Her name was already ruined when you sold it." The words cracked the air like a whip. For a moment, nobody breathed. Rain began to fall, gentle but cold. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, hat in his hands. Pa's voice wavered. "You think living like animals makes you free?" I stepped between them, the mud soaking my boots. "No," I said, "but it made me honest. It made me whole." He looked at me then, not as a daughter, not even as a burden, but as something he couldn't control anymore. The kind of look men give when they realize the world's moved on without their permission. He turned his horse and rode off without another word. The sheriff tipped his hat to me before following. Their shapes vanished down the trail until only the sound of rain remained. I stood there shaking, not from fear but from release. Elias reached out, his hand rough, warm, steady. He didn't pull me close, didn't speak comfort. He just let me hold on until the storm quieted. That night, as the firelight painted the walls gold, I sat by the window and watched the rain. The bird he'd carved months ago still rested on the sill, its wings open, ready for flight. I ran a finger over its smooth back and smiled. In that silence, I thought about all the ways people break one another, how words can cut deeper than any whip. But I also thought about the small mercies that healed those wounds. A cup of coffee left beside trembling hands, a space by the fire, a man who doesn't ask you to be less. Years later, when I tell this story, folks ask if I ever left that mountain. I tell them I did sometimes. But part of me stayed there forever, in that cabin where the snow once fell and shame melted into something kinder. They say the mountain changes people. Maybe it don't. Maybe it just strips away the noise until you hear your own heart again. I was 16 when I thought my life was over, 30 when I realized it had just begun. And somewhere in those years between, a man who'd buried his peace found it again. In the laughter of a girl who finally learned to stand tall in her own skin.